Curtis. I am so pleased to be able to speak with you today, to be able to sit with you. Thank you for meeting with me.
Thank
And
you for inviting me.
yes, yes. So, Vice President at Safe Horizon, and you've been in this field for over 30 years and have also had a hand in training the police departments on how to respond to domestic violence calls. This area is so fascinating to me, and I've really been excited to talk to you for a long time. I've been wanting to have this chat.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to dive straight in and ask about psychological and covert abuse. In my personal healing journey, I've seen that this precedes further victimization. And I want to know, how does emotional manipulation set the stage for that?
So many people, abusers, will start with emotional abuse, belittling, manipulation, just not treating that person fairly. And this emotional abuse and psychological abuse often leads to physical and sexual abuse. And sadly, it's, so many survivors say how extremely damaging it is, more so than physical and sexual violence.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the scars, they say, from psychological and emotional abuse. I mean, I've heard from so many survivors, and I've been doing this work now for close to 40 years, and they say that the scars that are left are, that much more difficult than physical scars. And I think what also compounds it is that as a society, when we think of domestic violence, we don't think about emotional or psychological abuse. We don't think about manipulation, about, controlling behavior as a form of domestic violence, unless there's also physical abuse and sexual abuse. And oftentimes, even with sexual abuse, they think it's with, there needs to be that physical abuse. And yet, even when there isn't physical abuse, that controlling, at times when it's, coercive control in a relationship, really does so much harm to the survivor. And if there's children in the home, it does a lot of damage as well to the children in the home. I think the other thing that is, that I've seen over the years is, in the domestic violence field, we have dependent on the criminal justice system to assist survivors. And emotional and psychological abuse is not recognized by the criminal justice system unless there is, possibly an order of protection where there could be a term. But, and that, I think, if a survivor wants a response from the police and there isn't physical abuse or sexual abuse, it can be very difficult. And then that just adds to the hurt that survivor experiences, because now they're not only being hurt by the person that they love, they're being hurt by the system that's responding to them and should be helping them.
Right. Right. Yeah, there's a lot of misconception around emotional abuse, covert abuse.
Right.
And when it comes to the justice system, how do you prove something that can be so subtle, right? So in my experience, it was about collecting, mounting evidence, and it had to eventually have a pattern emerge in order for it to show.
Right.
But it's not like being able to come in and say, hey, I have a bruise.
Right.
And then immediately people know what's going on.
Right.
It's so much more subtle and manipulative than that.
Right.
I've personally witnessed the damage that psychological and covert abuse can inflict. Some of the tactics that I've witnessed are gaslighting, being isolated from loved ones, intermittent reinforcement, threats. There's even a term called triangulation, where the abuser can attempt to make your loved ones or friends turn against you by using a series of lies. So there's a lot of sneaky things that could go on.
Right.
Can you shed light on that often subtle nature of emotional abuse and perhaps some of the signs that individuals can look for to identify it, especially when it's not leaving physical marks?
I mean, I think that there's, exactly what you just said, like isolation. If that person that you are in a relationship with is isolating you, is extremely jealous, and initially it could seem like that is something that is seen as love. Maybe they're belittling you and manipulating you. All of this, are signs that they're controlling you, but it's not physical. So maybe they're tracking if you have a car, and you say you're going to the store, how many miles is it to the store and back? So they're monitoring your behavior. And initially, when the person says it's out of love, particularly if you are in love with this person, we think, well, this is somebody that you're in a relationship with. And maybe, I think one of the hardest things for many people to understand, I mean, even those who are in the field, even advocates, is when, the individual says that they love the person that is hurting them, because they don't want to believe that this manipulation, that this abusive, this belittling, this controlling psychological behavior is happening. And sometimes it leads to physical abuse, sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
And it's still abusive behavior, but if you are turning to somebody, say family, friends, or the criminal justice system, it's not necessarily seen as abusive behavior. So you're not believed, oh, don't worry about it. It's not so bad, because they may think of, or they are thinking of abusive behavior as physical. So if that person is not hitting you, and you may hear me refer to the harming party as he, and and not to say that men can't be victims in intimate partner violence, but so many times it's the woman who is the person who's being abused. And I think all of that impacts the person's self-esteem, so that, and particularly when there's isolation involved, they are no longer able to turn to family and friends, or sometimes maybe they've been turning to their family or friends because the survivor is not doing what the family or friends think they should be doing. They're not there to support them in the way that they could or should.
There's been this growing fascination across popular culture and media about stories of narcissistic abuse. I have done a lot of research myself, and I like to call those with narcissistic personality disorder somewhat of a poster child of these particular manipulation tactics and covert abuse. Now, I think it's important to preface that not all abusers have disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, but those with it always do abuse. And so in the cacophony of all this talk about this in popular culture, one of the things that I discuss in my book is how some misinterpretation of it could drown out the voices of the victims that might be going through this type of emotional abuse. How does society's misunderstanding of emotional abuse impact the disbelief that victims sometimes face?
I mean, I think that, it goes back to not seeing emotional abuse as domestic violence, and I think that when you have that umbrella over it, it's hard to believe that the person, is in an abusive relationship just because, and I put that in quotes, there's emotional abuse. When I think about narcissistic behavior, yes, that could lead to, and likely does lead to, abusive behavior, but we also want to be careful that we're not excusing the behavior of that person because they have been diagnosed with narcissism. I mean, because that happened years ago, where, because we didn't want to, as a society, we didn't want to, see that domestic violence was so prevalent, we would often label it as, well, this person has to have a mental illness. Otherwise, why would they be abusive? So, there's no doubt that that also could be happening with narcissistic behavior. And if that person is now abusive, the excuse could be there that they have a disorder. So therefore, the survivor is the one that needs to be more accepting, because we need to sympathize with the person who has a disorder and not necessarily understand the impact that abuse is having on that survivor. So all of that mixed together, it leads to dismissing the behavior, which is a way of not believing the survivor. And now if that survivor is the person who is, because of their trauma, acting out. I mean, we see it sadly even in the police department. The term EDP, emotionally disturbed person, and we never, or I shouldn't say we never, we hardly ever see that term assigned to an abusive partner. We see that assigned because of the trauma. They could be responding, particularly if they're not believed, particularly if they're being dismissed.
Absolutely.
And yet that other person who has control of their behavior, controls of their feelings, are seen as the person who is sometimes even abused in the relationship.
Absolutely, yes. There's a lot of misinterpretation and deceptive behavior that can be going on.
Right.
So it can be quite confusing if you don't know how to pick it apart or decipher what's going on.
Exactly.
So speaking to that, in the context of coercive control, abusers sometimes use something called reactive abuse, which is like baiting their victim, right? They know exactly which buttons to push, and this is done intentionally to get a reactive outburst from the victim and have them appear unstable, or even like they're the abusive one in the relationship. And then they're seen that way to the outside world. Can you provide some examples of how that manifests in real life situations?
What comes to mind is, and it could be a person reacting to being provoked by the abusive party. It could also be a person who's defending themselves because of what is happening. Because now, that person could be using words and language, but maybe it was physical previously. So those words and language now in that survivor's world means that it could lead to violence. So they go into protective mode, and they could be protecting themselves, and that could lead to them becoming violent against that person, or to become verbally, I don't want to say abusive, but to respond by yelling or and that's another way of protecting themselves. And there's no doubt in my mind that we're less accepting, particularly when it's in a relationship between a man and a woman. We are less accepting of a woman who becomes aggressive than we are of a man becoming aggressive, because women aren't supposed to be aggressive. They're not supposed to act out. They're not supposed to become violent, and that's the way we look at women in our society. Once again, just to go back to the police, if the police are called, whether they're called by either of the parties or they're called by a neighbor or a friend, they should be, to the best of their ability. There's a law called primary aggressor law determining who is the primary aggressor here. Because just because in New York State, if it's verbal abuse or it's emotional abuse or psychological abuse, no matter how escalated it gets, that's not a crime in New York State. But if it leads to physical violence by both parties, the police are required to determine the primary aggressor in that relationship. And one of the things that they should be considering is the previous history. What is happening here? What has happened here, so that they can, help the right person. Sure. And not, because sadly, the reason this became a law was a lot of survivors were getting arrested, whether it was because of reactive, whether it was because of self-defense, unfairly, they were getting arrested under laws that were put in place many years ago to protect survivors from being physically abused by the harming party.
Right, right. And in terms of reactive abuse, the one thing that's missing in the big picture to the outside world is the months or years
That's right.
of abuse that the victim has been enduring,
Right.
possibly in silent terror.
Right. And the police are not, I'm sorry, the police are not trained to assess for that. You know, even in the primary aggressor, they're not going to look at all that history that you just mentioned. They're going to look at how many 911 calls were there, who were the callers, you know, who has the injuries here, like if they're both injured. These are the factors that they're looked at, but not the previous history of emotional, psychological, coercive control. And it's problematic in many ways, but it's also can be, you know, we work with, you know, some of the most high risk clients that I have worked with over the years and staff have worked with are those where there may not be physical violence. There may not be a police history, but there is that coercive control. There is that threat that has happened. There's that psychological manipulation. And this is a risk indicator of future lethal violence. So it's more likely there's an increased likelihood that it could end up in lethality, even when there hasn't been physical violence at all or ever. And yet, to get the police to see that is very hard. They want to see police reports. They want to see physical violence. They want to see sexual violence. And I'm not blaming the police. I think that this is just the way the criminal justice system is set up.
Sure. And a lot of these manipulative abusers can use these tactics over and over again and be pushing these boundaries against the victim without technically overstepping the law.
Right.
So they're like skirting it a lot.
Exactly. And yet, what you're saying, the damage that's done by those threats, by that psychological and emotional abuse is what we hear from so many survivors the most damaging and the hardest to move on with in their lives when they might have ended that relationship with the person abusing them.
Yeah. So Maureen, in my experience, I was 3 months pregnant with my only child, my first child, and I had been enduring a lot of psychological and covert abuse. And at that point, being in that vulnerable state that I was in, I finally broke down. I started to sob. I started to shout. And interestingly enough, this was a moment that my former abuser took to pick up his phone and video record me in this vulnerable moment and try to document this as some kind of proof that I was being unstable.
Right.
So in that moment, I felt like I needed help, and I called the police for help. And I tried to explain everything that had been going on and the mounting fear that had been happening over all this amount of time. But in that moment, because he showed them this video of me having an outburst and sobbing and shouting, they ended up taking me, and I was arrested. And that was such a traumatic experience for me, on top of everything else. I had never been in a position like that in my life. And I had to endure this situation, which was very difficult. And so not only has the experience of the abuse been really difficult for me, but that's also something that has been very painful for me to get over. I've been hearing of a number of cases of survivors who have had their abusers record their reactions during abuse to portray them as aggressors. So what protocols can law enforcement adopt to critically assess, let's say, video evidence in abuse cases to prevent wrongful arrests?
Well, I think that the first thing I will say is enforce the protocols that are already in place. And the first is the primary aggressor, because just because you have a recording of somebody who is coming across as escalated, or even, you know, depending on what is on that recording, what could be seen as abusive, the officers are required to determine primary aggressor. Now, I'm speaking about in New York State. It varies from state to state. And that's the first thing that they should do, is enforce what's already in place, because that can make a difference. And sadly, the reason that primary aggressor laws were put in place across the country was because when mandatory arrest laws went into effect back in the 1980s across the country, survivors were getting arrested in exactly the scenario that you just described. And it was helpful in some ways because the person causing harm was also could be arrested, but so many survivors were getting arrested. And they realized that they needed to put a law in place that will prevent, reduce, but hopefully in the best case scenario, prevent survivors from getting arrested in a scenario that you just described. But as with any law or any protocol, it has to be enforced, and the officers need to be trained. We just recently had conversations with the police department about, doing more training, which they have been doing on primary aggressor to ensure that survivors are not getting arrested. We also have, this is new for our agency, just recent funding in the past year that gave us 2 advocates focusing specifically on criminalized survivors. So these are advocates that work with survivors who have become criminalized because of the abusive party. So it could be something that was happening in the moment. Maybe the person was forced into trafficking or forced into stealing something because, of the manipulation that's happening and the control that's happening in that relationship. And these advocates not only will help the survivor if there's an arrest, but hopefully help to prevent that arrest. So the advocates work with the NYPD and work with our precinct advocates to hopefully prevent that arrest.
Sure.
I think the last thing I'll say about this is that the other thing that I think would be really helpful for the police is to do more training on coercive control.
Yes.
And what that means in the academy, ongoing throughout their career, so that when they respond to a domestic violence call and a person who's causing harm shows a video, they'll know enough about coercive control to know this is not the end all or be all. I should be looking at this, not just in the way I would look at the basic primary aggressor assessment, but looking at more at the history of the violence that's happening in that home, in that relationship. And that can make a difference in, one, properly identifying who is the survivor and who is the harming party in that relationship. And just as importantly, I believe, when there are children in the home, it's sending a message to the children that the police are helping the right person and not demonizing that person or not criminalizing that person by, arresting. Because, one of the things I've heard also over the years is, well, we'll just arrest both parties, and let the courts, decide. But, after hearing your experience and hearing from other survivors, even if it doesn't go further than arraignment or the complaint room, that person still is arrested. They're brought out in, handcuffs, possibly in front of their children. Maybe now child welfare is involved because this arrest occurred.
It was certainly a shocking result for me because I was the one who called for help.
Right.
So I was so surprised that that's what ended up happening.
Right.
In the end, the police officers did not pursue the case. When I showed up to court, it had been dismissed. Right. So I didn't even have to appear in front of the judge.
Right.
And it was immediately expunged. I think it's probably because they saw that I had absolutely no record.
Right.
There was nothing to show that I could have been the aggressor. So in the end, that was a positive outcome. But at the same time, it left an invisible scar that I will carry as the lowest point in my life.
Yeah. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. That is horrific. I can't even imagine, getting arrested, particularly when you're the one who called the police for help. And as you said, even though it didn't go any further, you were still arrested, and I think the damage to you and the damage that's ongoing in how that makes you feel, and also the lack of trust now I would imagine you have in calling the police, even if your life is in danger. Not being able to feel comfortable to pick up that phone and call 911 because of the experience that you had previously is horrific. It's horrible. You know, when we've talked about training, we've talked about having advocates come in and not just train on the law and what the police should be doing in terms of their investigation and assessment around primary aggressor, but have an advocate. And, you know, if sometimes it's a survivor advocate, come in and talk about what the impact is on that survivor if that person is arrested and shouldn't have been arrested.
Right.
For them to really understand the impact that that arrest, even if it goes nowhere, has on that person, both in the moment and, you know, ongoing.
One of the many reasons I've been so fascinated with your work is because I know that you have been key in implementing some training programs for the police departments and also placing advocates in different precincts throughout New York City, which is very, very important.
As I mentioned, I've been doing this work for many, many years now. And there's been a lot of laws, policies, protocols, trainings. And what I still see happening with police, but also in our society, is victim blaming, is blaming that person for the violence that's brought on them and not believing that person and not understanding the trauma that that person is living with and the terror that that person could be living with, even when there isn't physical violence. What they could do better, and I've seen this start to happen in the last couple of years, and my whole career has been with working with the NYPD, is they are starting to recognize and understand the importance of a compassionate, empathetic response. I'll never forget, I attend, they're called DOMSTAT meetings. I don't know if you've heard, they're modeled on CompStat. And CompStat was created many years ago where they brought in precinct leaders, so the commanding officers, to focus on crime in their precinct, and then they would grill the precinct commanders as to what are they doing. So if there's a series of burglaries in their area, what is that commanding officer and the police officers in that precinct doing to address the burglaries or robberies? Over the years, this CompStat was created called DOMSTAT, specific for police officers responding to domestic violence incidents. So, and I've been attending these for many years, and it's the chief of the domestic violence unit at the NYPD that would lead this meeting. A couple of years ago, under one of the chiefs of the domestic violence unit, I was blown away when he talked to a commanding officer in a precinct. They had just looked at some body camera of the officer, which is another thing that they've started looking at, which I think is really great. And he asked the commanding officer, do you think your officer was responding in a compassionate way? Do you think that survivor felt believed and valued? I mean, I sat back and I was like, oh my goodness. You know, it was always about accountability. And believe me, I'm a big person on accountability. Accountability is important. I think that if there's consequences for actions, that often leads to behavior changes and changes in belief system. But you also have to look at helping the person to understand what the impact is if you do it differently. And to talk about a compassionate response and recognizing that survivor's trauma was the first time I ever heard a leader in the NYPD say that. And now we're hearing this more, where the recognition, it's not just about upholding the law and their policies and arresting when they should, but how you respond. More recently, I heard another leader in one of these DOMSTAT meetings where they were looking at body camera, and in the body camera, the officer didn't respond appropriately to the survivor. And the chief said in the meeting, I think the officer should go back to that survivor and say, I'm sorry for my response.
That's powerful.
Oh my God. I was like blown away. I was like, because that's real. And that is something a survivor is going to remember. Yes, she's going to remember not being treated fairly and not being treated right. But if somebody owns it and apologizes for it, it can make a difference. And saying this in a meeting like this, it recognizes, because once again, it was just the way, the tone sometimes of the way that they talk, that it was clear that she wasn't being believed, and yet they were taking steps in the way that they should under the law. But if the message is, I don't really believe you, but I'm doing what I should be doing, that is what the survivor is going to remember. And I think that that's something that has started and is happening in the NYPD. And we're talking more about doing more trauma-informed, compassionate training, so that it's not just specialized units that receive these trainings, but the patrol officers, because the patrol officers are the ones who do respond to the 911 call. And that first impression is going to make a difference in now whether that survivor is going to feel okay. And if they don't feel that they can turn to the police when their life is in danger, then it makes them even more isolated.
Absolutely.
And that is so dangerous.
Your work emphasizes a client-centered approach. What are the key principles of this? And can you share a brief success story of that impact?
Yes. So the key principles of client-centered is to, be non-judgmental, to believe the survivor, to do a safety assessment and not just look at the physical, and to support the survivor, that the survivor would prioritize the risks that they want to prioritize, and then support the survivor and partner with them to develop a safety plan. A success, first, if it's okay, I'd like to give you an example of a time that I worked with a survivor where I was not client-centered. And it wasn't that I was judgmental. I always thought of judgmental as, you did what? How could you have, done that? Or judgment is also where we tell a person what to do. And this was when this is many years ago, when I worked in a precinct, and the client was brought into the precinct. They had just arrested her partner, and she was very upset. She was crying. She was beaten up and down one side of her body. And I thought she was crying because of the physical abuse. When she stopped crying and she told me her story, she had 2 young children. She had been living in cars and abandoned buildings with her 2 children. She met this man who, she said, took her in, was basically a good provider for her, a good father for her children. They loved him. And yes, he beat her. And yes, this was the most violent time that he had been with her. What I didn't hear, and at the time, my focus was, because this was a very high-risk case, was for her to go into shelter. And this was where I wasn't being client-centered, because all I could think about was, in my head, what was safest for her was for her to go into shelter, where the risk she was prioritizing was the risk of homelessness. She did not want to be homeless again. So she didn't want the arrest. That's why she was crying. She wanted to go back home with her partner. And I missed the opportunity to safety plan with her about going back, because I was so focused on what I thought was the safest thing for her, and not hearing the risk that she wanted to prioritize, which was, becoming homeless again. Fast forward to more recently working with a survivor, also in a very high-risk situation. I think that this is where it could be very difficult to be client-centered, because particularly when we're so used to traditional systems to help survivors. They need to file a police report. They need to get an order of protection. They should go into shelter. They need to leave the abusive partner. When we know that that's not the best for all survivors, particularly when they're identifying other emotional or environmental risks. And this woman, very abusive physical relationship, there was a lot of coercive control in her relationship. She had a son who was 9 years old, who was on the spectrum of autism. And she told me she had finally found a school for him where he was thriving after several attempts to get, to find a good school for him. So she was telling me shelter wasn't an option. And And I'll admit, in my head, I'm thinking shelter because I was worried that this was going to lead to future lethal violence. But I heard her. I heard that she was prioritizing. And I asked her, I hear that you're concerned about your son being taken out of the school because if she went into shelter, it would be in another area where it would be difficult for her son to go to school. And I heard that. And I didn't miss the opportunity to safety plan with her around staying, because that's what she was choosing to do. Stay and manage her risk of the physical violence, because the risk of harm coming to her child by taking him out of school far outweighed the risk of future violence. And that's an example of being client-centered, really hearing and listening to what the client's story is, not automatically jumping to what we think is safe, and particularly when it's in what we consider traditional safety options, but hearing and exploring and partnering with that person around what's best for them. I mean, years ago, we'd have a one-pager for safety planning, and it was all about if you plan to leave or when you plan to leave. Even though we said we were supporting a person's choice to stay in an abusive relationship, that one pager that we would give out to all survivors, and I'm dating myself here, this was many years ago, was not client-centered, because we weren't hearing that maybe that person never going to leave, and that's their choice. And that, is something that we need to support, because if and when that person is ready to leave, we want to make sure that they feel comfortable coming back to us because they felt heard, they felt listened to, and they felt believed.
I think it's interesting. A lot of people often ask, why didn't they leave?
Yep.
But perhaps a better question could be, why was the abuser that way? Why did they keep abusing?
Exactly. And that, it's one of my things with, sadly, even when there's a homicide and a survivor has been killed, and you read something in the paper, it's all about what that person did or didn't do. Did they leave? Did they stay? Did they get an order of protection? Did they call the police? And never about what that person who committed the homicide did. And even when that person is killed, we're still blaming and looking to what they did or should have done to protect themselves, as opposed to putting the accountability where it should be.
Right.
And I think that is how you change behavior is and recognizing, as I said, I'm a big believer in accountability. I think that we should be more cognizant of also the trauma that person could be or has experienced over the years themselves, but not excuse the behavior. Right. Hold them accountable, but help them in getting services and addressing their trauma, if there is trauma, and oftentimes there is.
So, Maureen, you've held a key role in developing programs for victims in the criminal justice system. Something I want to ask about is how the internet now poses new challenges for abuse. In my book, I talk about some examples like cyber stalking, cyber abuse, smear campaigns. What preventative steps can be taken within the justice system to address issues of modern technology in these cases?
That's a very good question. I think that, the justice system needs to play catch up to how prevalent cyber stalking is, revenge porn is, smear tactics, all of that. And there has been some movement where, there are specialized units in some of the DA's offices that address this. There is more training on, what cyber stalking is. But I think that stalking in all of its forms is a crime, has been a crime since the late 1990s, I believe. And it's the most underreported crime. I can describe behavior that meets what's called the penal code definition of stalking, and it can be very, very difficult to get the police to see that as stalking. It gets written up as harassment. Right. And that is in the eyes of the criminal justice system, not a crime, so it's not arrestable, whereas stalking is. And that is in all forms of stalking, whether it's stalking, whether I'm monitoring your behavior, whether I'm showing up at the train station when you come out of work, or it's cyber stalking. I think that sadly, it's also the one crime where the survivor has to keep their own documentation. When we work with survivors who are being stalked, we know that if they choose to turn to the criminal justice system, because we're going to explore all options with them, but if they choose to turn to the criminal justice system, having a log, having paper that can show that it's ongoing, so that either the survivor can talk to the police and convince the police that this should be written up as stalking if that's what they want, or an advocate can help to advocate that the police see this as stalking. Or if you're not successful with the police, maybe speaking with the district attorney's office and getting them involved so that they can also advocate with the police to get the report written up. Or you can go into family court and get a family court order of protection that will be written into that, that the person is not to do X, Y, and Z. So now it takes these behaviors, if it's not written up as stalking, can become a violation of an order of protection, and there can be action in that way. I think the other thing that I would love to say about this is that involving the criminal justice system could escalate the stalking, and it may not lead to the relief that person wants, or the criminal justice system could be the best thing, because the threat for that person causing harm could be enough for that person to stop their behavior. So speaking down with an advocate so that they can explore what are all the options. Because another option that's outside of the criminal justice system is Cornell University started a program where if a survivor, and they were in all the family justice centers here in New York City, but this program, a survivor could come in with their devices, with their laptop, with their phone, and they would check for any types of bugs. So that, and if they were there, they would clean it out. And then safety planning was provided around, because sometimes, that could be what can help prevent that person from continuing to stalk them through the internet and through social media.
In my experience, the only way that I was really able to show the inconsistencies in my abuser's actions was to document, and then only then did a pattern emerge that I was able to show to the courts, and then I was able to get an order of protection. Right. But it can be quite difficult navigating the internet and anything that has to do with cyber abuse. I call it something of a wild, wild west.
Yeah.
How can the criminal justice system gain better knowledge and integrate it in terms of cases that have to do with narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder like sociopathy or psychopathy?
Now you're kind of into the world of coercive control. What I would love to see happen is, rather than criminalizing coercive control, which would add another crime to domestic violence, which could, help some survivors but harm other survivors, is let's get the police to really understand and, write up reports for stalking, which is a crime, so that those survivors who do want relief from the criminal justice system can get it through stalking. Because a lot of these behaviors that we're talking about that are within, the realm of coercive control fall under stalking, where this behavior that in and of itself are not criminal, but when it places the person in fear, now it becomes, and it's ongoing pattern, it becomes criminal.
To wrap up, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I would like to address this one for our listeners who might be experiencing abuse, or perhaps for those out there that are listening who may want to help. Can you share a story of a survivor who took crucial steps toward healing, and what our listeners can learn from their journey?
I mean, I think that, what's really important to know for survivors is what works for me may not work for you. And, I have worked with survivors who have found justice through the criminal justice system or through family court. I've worked with survivors who have found justice by being advocates and really speaking up and speaking out, you know, advocates and activists, and they have found justice. I've worked with survivors who have found therapy, whether it be art therapy or talk therapy, to help them, address their trauma. I think that, you know, we have moved away, and I'm really glad that we have, of a one size fits all, and knowing that, you know, as I said, what works for me may not work for another person. And I think that the other thing that I would say, and this also comes from survivors, I was on a panel one time, and they asked the survivor, what can we do to help you in your healing from the abuse that you have experienced? And the survivor said, believe me. Believe me, and don't judge me, and listen to me. And to me, it was so powerful, because that can be the starting point for a person's healing journey. And what that healing journey, you know, as I said, will look different depending on who you are and what may be helpful for you. And you know, we really underestimate that, you know.
Yeah.
We forget how powerful that is, you know, for just to listen to that person.
Right.
And then by listening to them, you have started them on their journey. I'll always remember a survivor coming back to me and just simply saying, Maureen, I'm in a different place right now. I wasn't ready to leave, but the fact that you listened to me and didn't judge me, I just wanted you to know how powerful that was and how much that meant to me. And, you know, and I get chills just thinking about that. And that, you know, it's so simple, but it's so powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. Maureen, thank you so much for your time. I know that you all have such amazing programs and things that keep you very busy here at Safe Horizon, but I am really, really grateful that you took the time to be able to talk to me, and for our listeners to be able to hear all this information is so valuable.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for, you know, asking me such thoughtful questions, and for allowing me to share my experience and my thoughts about, you know, my pretty much life's work of working with survivors. And thank you.
Well, the work you do is much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.